The smell of wilted flowers and cold coffee filled the funeral parlor. Dad passed away on a quiet dawn, just as he had always lived, silent, hard-working, tough on himself and everyone around him. I stood there beside the casket, trying to hold my grief between my fingers, while my sister Clarice barely disguised her nervousness. She was crying too much, but it wasn't pain, it was desperation. 2 days after the burial, she was already calling real estate agents, talking about the family lands as if they were hers. But she didn't know one thing. Dad had transferred that property to me while he was still alive. The deed had been in my name for 3 years. I stayed silent, watching. Clarice excluded me from conversations, called a lawyer, scheduled meetings with potential buyers. I received screenshots, voice messages, everything. One of the real estate agents was someone I knew. He warned me, "Your sister is trying to sell lands that are in your name, without a signed deed." That's when I realized this wasn't just greed. It was desperation disguised as arrogance. Clarice owed money, lived for appearances, and saw those lands as quick salvation. She didn't even wait for the will reading. On the day of the reading, she showed up in heels, heavy makeup, and a smile of someone who already saw herself rich. But the lawyer was direct. Mr. Amadeo officially left the lands to his son Lucas, having made the legal transfer at the notary office in 2022. To his daughter Clarice, he leaves the old car and a personal letter. Clarice went pale. I remained silent. It wasn't time to triumph. The letter said, "Clarice, my daughter, those who don't take care of what they have, lose what they desire. I hope someday you understand the value of roots, and not just what can be torn from them." As we left, she grabbed my arm. "You knew about this the whole time?" "I knew, but I wanted to see how far you'd go." "You think you're the perfect son?" "No, I just don't sell what isn't mine." She looked at me as if I had taken away her last chance at redemption. But no, Dad had simply protected what little remained of him. Today I take care of the lands. I planted a small garden. I transformed the old house into a welcoming space for rural youth. Sometimes Clarice shows up. She brings bread, clothes, tries to participate. I never speak of the past, because forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's planting again in soil that was trampled. But one thing is certain, that land, that piece of ground, will never again be treated as a bargaining object. It's memory. It's justice. It's the legacy of someone who worked with his hands and died with a clean soul. The weight of that inheritance sits heavy on my shoulders sometimes, not because of its burden, but because of its responsibility. Every morning when I walk across the property, I see Dad's footsteps in the soil he turned year after year. The old fence posts he hammered in with his own hands still stand crooked but strong like his principles. The ancient oak tree where he used to sit and smoke his evening cigarette after long days in the field, its bark scarred but enduring, just like the man who raised us. Clarice never understood this connection. To her, land was always something to be converted into numbers on a bank statement. She saw square footage and market value where Dad and I saw seasons changing, crops growing, life cycling through its eternal dance. When we were children, she would complain about the mud on her shoes after helping with chores, while I would run barefoot through the furrows, feeling the earth between my toes like a promise of belonging. The irony wasn't lost on me that she had tried to sell something she had never truly owned, not because of the legal technicalities, but because ownership requires understanding. You cannot possess what you do not love, cannot inherit what you refuse to nurture. Dad knew this. It's why he made the transfer quietly, without fanfare or family meetings or dramatic declarations. He simply went to the notary office one Tuesday morning, signed the papers, and came home to tend his tomatoes. I remember that day clearly now, though I didn't understand its significance then. He had called me to help him repair a section of irrigation pipe that had burst during the night. We worked in comfortable silence, our hands moving in synchronized motions born from years of shared labor. When we finished, he sat on an overturned bucket and pulled out his cigarettes. "This land has stories," he said, lighting up and squinting against the smoke. "Every furrow, every stone, every tree. Stories of your grandfather, your great-grandfather, men who understood that wealth isn't what you take from the earth, but what you give back to it." I nodded, thinking he was just being philosophical in his old age. Dad had always been prone to such moments, especially after Mom died, but now I realize he was preparing me, in his quiet way, for the responsibility that would soon be mine. The weeks following the will reading were difficult. Clarice oscillated between fury and pleading, sometimes calling me at dawn to rage about unfairness, other times showing up at my door with tears and stories about her debts, her failed marriage, her desperate need for a fresh start. I listened to it all with the patience Dad had taught me, but I never wavered. The land would not be sold. "You're being selfish," she accused during one particularly heated argument. "Dad left you everything and me with nothing. How is that fair?" "He left you what you were prepared to receive," I replied. "A car you can drive away in when you're ready to leave the past behind. But this land requires presence, Clarice. It needs someone who will stay." She didn't understand then, and perhaps she never will. But understanding wasn't a prerequisite for forgiveness. When she started showing up with bread and old clothes, offering to help with the youth program I had started, I accepted her gestures without question. Not because I had forgotten her betrayal, but because the land had taught me something about redemption. The soil doesn't hold grudges. Each season, it accepts new seeds regardless of the mistakes of previous harvests. It transforms decay into nourishment, death into new life. This is the wisdom Dad embedded in every acre, the lesson he hoped we would both learn. The youth program grew beyond my expectations. Kids from nearby towns would come on weekends to learn about sustainable farming, to understand where their food comes from, to connect with something real in an increasingly digital world. I would watch them discover the same wonder I had felt as a child, kneeling in the dirt, amazed by the miracle of growth. One Saturday afternoon, a teenage girl named Maria was helping me harvest vegetables when she asked, "Mr. Lucas, why do you do this? You could make more money selling this land to developers." I paused, my hands full of carrots still warm from the earth. "Because some things are worth more than money," I said. "This land feeds people. It teaches patience. It connects us to something bigger than ourselves. If I sold it, all of that would be lost forever." She nodded thoughtfully, and I saw in her eyes the same recognition that had sparked in mine all those years ago. This is how the land perpetuates itself, not through legal documents or family names, but through the hearts it touches, the lives it changes, the values it instills. Clarice witnessed this exchange from the porch where she was sorting donated clothes. Later, as the kids were leaving, she approached me hesitantly. "I'm beginning to understand," she said quietly, "what Dad saw in you, what this place means." "It's not too late," I told her. "The land doesn't care about the past. It only cares about who's willing to tend it." She smiled sadly. "I think we both know I'm not that person, but maybe I can help in other ways." And she has. Slowly, carefully, Clarice has found her place in the legacy Dad left behind, not as an owner or inheritor in the traditional sense, but as a guardian of memory, a bridge between the past and the future. She started documenting the family history, collecting stories from neighbors who remembered our grandparents, preserving the oral traditions that give the land its deeper meaning. The old car Dad left her became a mobile outreach vehicle, carrying supplies to rural families in need, transporting elderly community members to medical appointments, serving as a lifeline for those who, like us, had chosen to stay close to the earth rather than chase urban dreams. 3 years have passed since that day in the lawyer's office. The land thrives, not just agriculturally, but spiritually. It has become a gathering place for the community, a center of learning and growth that extends far beyond its property lines. Dad's dream, though he never articulated it as such, has been realized. Sometimes in the early morning hours when mist rises from the fields and the first light catches the dew on spider webs stretched between fence posts, I feel his presence strongly, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living force woven into the fabric of this place he loved so deeply. His hands are in every tool I use, his voice in every lesson I teach, his vision in every seed I plant. The title deed that bears my name is just paper. The real ownership lies in understanding, in commitment, in the willingness to see beyond immediate gratification to longer truths. Dad knew that Clarice, for all her faults, could learn these lessons if given time and space to grow. He knew that I, for all my strengths, would need her perspective to make the land truly whole. We are both his children, shaped by his love in different ways. The land he left us is both inheritance and teacher, gift and responsibility. Intending it together, she with her stories and outreach, me with my plants and programs, we honor not just his memory, but the enduring promise that some things transcend individual ownership. This is what home means. a place where the past informs the present, where mistakes can be transformed into wisdom, where love manifests not in what we possess, but in what we preserve. The land will outlive us both, just as it outlived Dad and his father before him. Our task is not to own it, but to be worthy of it, to ensure that future generations inherit not just property, but purpose. In the end, Dad's greatest gift was not the land itself, but the understanding that true wealth lies in what we cultivate, in the soil, in ourselves, in each other. Every sunset that paints the fields gold, every harvest that feeds hungry families, every young person who discovers their connection to the earth, these are the dividends of an investment that cannot be measured in dollars, but only in the depth of lives changed and communities strengthened. The deed may bear my name, but the land belongs to everyone who loves it enough to tend it. This is the inheritance Dad truly left us. Not property, but purpose. Not ownership, but stewardship. Not wealth, but wisdom. And in accepting this responsibility, Clarice and I have finally become the children he always hoped we would be. The story continues to unfold each day, written not in legal documents, but in the lives touched by this place, in the lessons learned from soil and seasons, in the quiet understanding that some inheritances are too precious to be sold. The land remembers everything, every footstep, every harvest, every act of love, and in its memory, Dad lives on, his legacy growing like the seeds he planted, reaching toward a future he could envision but would never see. This is his gift to us, to the community, to the world, proof that love, properly tended, yields harvests that last forever. The seasons turned, and with each cycle, the land revealed new layers of its complexity. Winter brought reflection and planning, the frozen ground holding secrets that would emerge with spring's first thaw. I would walk the dormant fields in those cold months, my breath visible in the crisp air, and think about the choices that had brought us to this point. The silence of winter was different from the silence Dad had carried. His was born of careful consideration, while winter's was pregnant with possibility. Spring always arrived with a rush of activity that reminded me why Dad had loved this work despite its demands. The youth program expanded to include overnight camps, where city kids could experience the full rhythm of farm life. They would arrive pale and uncertain, clutching smartphones like lifelines, and leave bronzed by sun and wind, their hands dirty but their eyes bright with new understanding. One particular spring, a boy named David came to us angry and lost. His parents had divorced, his grades were failing, and he'd been caught shoplifting twice. The court had ordered community service, and somehow he'd been assigned to our program. He arrived with a scowl and an attitude that reminded me painfully of Clarice during her worst moments. "This is stupid," he announced on his first day, surveying the fields with obvious disdain. "I don't know anything about farming, and I don't want to." I handed him a pair of work gloves without comment and led him to where I was preparing soil for planting. "Sometimes the things we don't want to do teach us the most about ourselves," I said, kneeling to examine the earth's texture. "Your job today is to help me understand what this soil needs." He stood there for a long moment, the gloves dangling from his hand like a challenge he wasn't sure he wanted to accept. Finally, reluctantly, he put them on and knelt beside me. By the end of that first day, he was asking questions about crop rotation and soil pH levels, his anger temporarily forgotten in the face of genuine curiosity. David returned every weekend for 6 months, long after his court-ordered hours were complete. I watched him change, not dramatically or suddenly, but with the gradual persistence of growing things. His shoulders straightened, his voice lost its defensive edge, and he began to speak about the future with something approaching hope. "Mr. Lucas," he said one afternoon as we harvested late tomatoes, "do you think I could do this? Really do this, I mean. Make a living from farming?" I looked at him, this angry boy who had become a thoughtful young man through his connection to the earth, and saw something of myself at his age. "The land will teach you everything you need to know," I told him. "The question is whether you're willing to listen." He nodded solemnly, and I knew he understood. This wasn't just about agriculture. It was about finding your place in the world, about understanding that growth requires patience, that failure is just another form of education, that the most important lessons come not from books, but from the willingness to engage with life directly. Clarice had been watching this transformation too, and it seemed to affect her deeply. One evening, as David was explaining to a group of newer kids how to identify different types of soil, she pulled me aside. "He reminds me of you at that age," she said quietly. "So serious, so committed to understanding everything perfectly." "He reminds me of you too," I replied. "Underneath all that anger, there's someone who desperately wants to belong somewhere." She was quiet for a long moment, watching David demonstrate proper planting technique with the patience of someone who had truly mastered the subject. "I wasted so many years," she said finally, "being angry at Dad, at you, at the life I thought I deserved instead of appreciating the one I had." "Time isn't wasted if it teaches you something valuable," I said. "Dad knew that. It's why he was so patient with both of us, even when we couldn't see past our own immediate needs." The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. Clarice began spending more time at the farm, not just helping with the youth program, but genuinely contributing to the daily operations. She had a gift for organization that I lacked, and soon she was coordinating volunteer schedules, managing supply orders, and maintaining the detailed records that any successful agricultural operation requires. More importantly, she began to understand the deeper rhythms of the land. She learned to read weather patterns, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when crops were ready for harvest, to appreciate the complex ecosystem that supported not just our vegetables but the countless creatures that called the farm home. One particularly busy summer, we were hosting our largest group of young people yet, 30 kids from various urban areas, all spending 2 weeks learning about sustainable agriculture. The logistics were overwhelming, and I was beginning to wonder if we had bitten off more than we could chew. That's when Clarice stepped in with the kind of calm efficiency that Dad would have admired. She organized the kids into teams, each responsible for different aspects of the farm operation. She created a rotation system that ensured everyone got experience with planting, tending, harvesting, and processing crops. Most impressively, she managed to turn what could have been chaos into a smoothly functioning community. "Where did you learn to do this?" I asked her one evening as we watched the kids gathered around a campfire, sharing stories about their experiences. "From watching Dad," she said simply. "I may not have understood what he was teaching at the time, but I was paying attention. He had this way of making every person feel important, every task feel meaningful. I'm just trying to honor that." It was true. Dad had possessed an almost supernatural ability to see potential in people and situations that others overlooked. He had seen past Clarice's materialism to the organizer and community builder she could become. He had recognized my connection to the land before I fully understood it myself. And somehow, through the patient work of years, his vision was coming to fruition. The farm began to attract attention from agricultural colleges and sustainable living organizations. Professors brought their students to see our methods in action. Environmental groups held workshops on our property. Local politicians visited to discuss rural development initiatives. Through it all, Clarice and I worked to maintain the essential character of the place, its rootedness in community, its commitment to education, its respect for the natural world. One autumn day, a delegation from the State Agriculture Department arrived for a formal visit. They had heard about our youth program and wanted to evaluate it as a potential model for other rural communities. I was nervous about the scrutiny, worried that official attention might change the fundamental nature of what we were doing. But Clarice handled the visit with remarkable grace. She led tours, explained our educational philosophy, and demonstrated the practical skills our young participants acquired. When the officials asked about our success rate, how many kids continued in agriculture after completing our program, she was ready with detailed statistics and follow-up stories. "The goal isn't necessarily to create more farmers," she explained to the group. "It's to create young people who understand where their food comes from, who appreciate the complexity of natural systems, who recognize their responsibility to care for the environment. Whether they become agricultural professionals or doctors or teachers, they carry these lessons with them." The officials were impressed, and within 6 months we received a state grant that allowed us to expand our facilities and reach even more young people. But more important than the money was the recognition that our father's vision, his understanding of land as both inheritance and responsibility, was being validated by the broader community. As winter approached again, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed since that day in the lawyer's office. The farm that Dad had quietly transferred to me had become something neither of us could have fully imagined. Not just a working agricultural operation, but a center of learning and healing that touched lives far beyond our property boundaries. David, the angry boy who had arrived 3 years earlier, was now studying agricultural science at the state university. He visited regularly, bringing classmates who were eager to see the farm where he had discovered his calling. His transformation was just one of dozens. Kids who had found direction, confidence, and purpose through their connection to the land. Clarice had evolved too, from the desperate woman who had tried to sell something she didn't understand, into a confident administrator and advocate for rural education. She had found her own way of honoring Dad's legacy, different from mine, but equally valid. Together, we had created something that was greater than either of us could have achieved alone. But perhaps the most significant change was in my own understanding of what inheritance truly means. I had always thought of myself as the guardian of Dad's land, the protector of his vision. Now I realized that we were all guardians. Every young person who learned to read the signs of changing weather, every volunteer who helped with harvest, every visitor who left with a deeper appreciation for the complexity of agriculture. The land belonged to all of us, and to none of us. We were temporary stewards, responsible for maintaining its health and productivity, so that future generations could continue to learn from it. This was the deeper meaning of Dad's quiet transfer of the deed, not favoritism or punishment, but in recognition that legal ownership was just the beginning of true stewardship. Spring came early that year, and with it a new group of young people eager to learn about farming. Among them was a girl named Sarah, whose grandmother had been a friend of our mother's. She had grown up hearing stories about our family's farm, and she arrived with a deep hunger to understand her own connection to the land. As I watched her kneel in the soil for the first time, her hands tentative but eager, I thought about the continuity of generations, how knowledge passes not just through blood relationships, but through shared commitment to something larger than individual desire. Sarah would learn from the land just as David had, just as I had, just as countless others would in years to come. The deed to the property still bears my name, but that seems increasingly irrelevant. What matters is the ongoing conversation between human need and natural abundance, the patient work of creating food and community, the recognition that true wealth lies not in what we own, but in what we nurture. Dad understood this from the beginning. His life was a testament to the idea that meaning comes from service, that security lies not in accumulation, but in connection, that the best inheritance we can leave is not money or property, but wisdom and example. Every furrow he plowed, every seed he planted, every lesson he taught through quiet demonstration was an investment in a future he would not see, but helped to make possible. Now, as I watch the sun set over fields that feed both body and soul, I understand that his greatest gift was not the land itself, but the understanding of how to live in proper relationship with it. This knowledge cannot be bought or sold, cannot be hoarded or divided, cannot be diminished by sharing. It grows stronger each time it is passed on, richer each time it takes root in a new heart. The story continues to unfold, written in the language of seasons and harvests, of young lives transformed and communities strengthened. Somewhere, Dad is smiling, knowing that his quiet faith in the power of land to teach and heal has been vindicated. The inheritance he left us was not property but possibility, the endless potential for growth, learning, and service that comes from understanding our place in the larger web of life. This is the true measure of his legacy, not the number of acres or the value of crops, but the depth of impact on human lives. In choosing to preserve and nurture rather than exploit and sell, we have honored not just his memory, but the eternal principle that some things are too valuable to be reduced to mere transactions. The land endures, the lessons continue, and the harvest of human potential grows richer with each passing season. Years flowed like the irrigation channels Dad had dug with his own hands, carrying life to every corner of the property. The farm had become more than either Clarice or I had ever imagined possible. What started as a simple youth education program had evolved into a comprehensive agricultural institute that attracted visitors from around the world. Universities sent their graduate students to study our sustainable methods. International development organizations came to learn how rural education could transform entire communities. Government officials from developing nations toured our facilities, hoping to replicate our model in their own countries. But success brought its own challenges. With growth came pressure to expand beyond our means, to commercialize our methods, to franchise our approach. Real estate developers circled like vultures, making increasingly generous offers for portions of the property. Agricultural corporations wanted to partner with us, promising resources and reach that would allow us to impact thousands more young lives. We could reach 10 times as many kids if we accepted their funding, Clarice said one evening as we reviewed yet another proposal from a major agribusiness company. Think about the difference we could make. I understood her temptation. The offers were substantial, and the potential for broader impact was real. But I also remembered Dad's warnings about the seductive nature of easy money, his belief that some things lost their essential character when they grew too large too quickly. Dad always said that the land teaches patience, I reminded her. Maybe we need to trust that we're growing at exactly the right pace. She nodded, but I could see the struggle in her eyes. Clarice had always been drawn to grand gestures and dramatic transformations. The steady, incremental work of building something lasting sometimes felt frustratingly slow to her. Yet she had learned enough about farming to understand that the most productive soil was built up gradually, layer by patient layer. That winter, we faced our first real crisis. A late-season storm damaged our main greenhouse and destroyed much of our seed storage facility. Insurance would cover the basic repairs, but we would lose an entire growing season unless we could find alternative space and funding quickly. The corporate partnerships we had rejected suddenly looked more appealing. It was David who suggested a different approach. Now graduated and working as an agricultural extension agent in the neighboring county, he had maintained close ties to the farm and still visited regularly. When he heard about our predicament, he proposed something unprecedented. "What if the solution comes from the community you've built?" he asked during an emergency planning meeting. "You've touched hundreds of lives over the years. Maybe it's time to let them give back." The idea seemed impossibly naive at first. How could former program participants and community supporters possibly raise the funds needed for major reconstruction? But David was persistent, and Clarice surprised me by embracing the concept enthusiastically. "He's right," she said. "We've been thinking like a business when we should be thinking like a family." What followed was one of the most remarkable demonstrations of community support I had ever witnessed. David created a crowdfunding campaign that told the story of the farm's impact through the voices of young people whose lives had been changed by their time with us. Sarah, now studying environmental science at a prestigious university, wrote about how the farm had taught her to see herself as part of a larger ecosystem. A young man named Marcus described how working with injured animals in our wildlife rehabilitation program had inspired him to become a veterinarian. A girl named Elena shared how learning to cook with vegetables she had grown herself had led to her opening a successful farm-to-table restaurant in the city. The campaign goal was ambitious: $50,000 to rebuild the greenhouse and create an even better seed storage facility. I was skeptical that we could raise even half that amount from our network of supporters. But within the first week, donations began pouring in, not just from former participants, but from their families, their teachers, their friends who had heard our story secondhand. Local businesses contributed materials and labor. The high school shop class volunteered to build custom storage cabinets. A regional bank offered a low-interest construction loan with terms so favorable they amounted to a gift. Most moving of all, dozens of former program participants took vacation time from their jobs to come help with the reconstruction work. I watched David and Sarah work side by side, installing ventilation systems in the new greenhouse, while discussing the latest research on climate-adaptive seed varieties. I saw Marcus carefully transplanting seedlings he had rescued from the storm damage, his veterinary training evident in the gentle precision of his movements. Elena arrived each morning with meals for the volunteer crews, the vegetables sourced from other small farms in the network we had helped establish. "Dad would have loved this," Clarice said as we surveyed the construction activity one afternoon. "All these young people working together, building something that will outlast all of us." She was right. This was exactly the kind of community-centered approach Dad had modeled throughout his life. He had never sought credit or recognition, never tried to build monuments to his own legacy. Instead, he had quietly planted seeds of knowledge and responsibility in everyone he encountered, trusting that they would grow in their own time and in their own way. The new facilities were completed just in time for spring planting, but the real harvest was the strengthened sense of community that emerged from the crisis. The young people who had returned to help with construction stayed connected in ways that surprised everyone. They formed an informal alumni network that met monthly to share updates on their various projects and careers. Some started their own educational programs in their home communities. Others pursued graduate studies in agriculture, environmental science, and rural development. Most significantly, several decided to return to our area permanently, purchasing small farms and starting families of their own. David was among them, buying a 40-acre plot adjacent to our property and specializing in heritage seed production. Sarah returned after completing her degree and started a nonprofit focused on connecting urban schools with rural agricultural programs. Marcus opened a veterinary practice that served not just domestic animals but also the wildlife rehabilitation work we had expanded over the years. The return of these young adults created a ripple effect throughout the region. Property values stabilized as young families moved in, bringing energy and innovation to communities that had been struggling with population decline. New businesses opened to serve the growing population. The local school district, which had been facing closure due to low enrollment, experienced a resurgence as young families chose to raise their children in an area that offered both rural benefits and educational opportunities. Clarice found herself at the center of this regional renaissance, using her organizational skills to coordinate economic development initiatives that honored the area's agricultural heritage while embracing sustainable innovation. She established a small business incubator that helped young entrepreneurs develop agriculture-related enterprises. She worked with state officials to designate the region as a sustainable agriculture demonstration zone, attracting research funding and technical support. But perhaps her most important contribution was the oral history project she initiated to preserve the stories of the area's longtime residents. She interviewed elderly farmers and their families, recording not just their memories but their accumulated wisdom about land management, weather patterns, and community cooperation. These recordings became the foundation for a multimedia archive that complemented the hands-on education we provided. Every old farmer is a library, she explained to a group of university researchers who came to study her documentation methods. When they die, whole volumes of knowledge disappear forever. We can't let that happen. The archive grew to include hundreds of hours of interviews, thousands of photographs, and detailed maps, showing how land use had evolved over generations. Young people in our programs learned to interview community elders as part of their education, creating intergenerational connections that benefited everyone involved. One particularly meaningful interview was with Mrs. Henderson, who had been a close friend of our mother's and had known our family for over 60 years. At 93, she still lived independently on the farm where she and her husband had raised 7 children. Her memories reached back to our grandfather's generation, and she could describe farming techniques and community traditions that had been forgotten by most people. "Your daddy was special," she told Clarice during one recording session. Not because he was smarter than other folks, but because he understood that farming isn't just about growing crops. It's about growing people. He could see what someone could become before they could see it themselves. She paused, looking out the window toward our property, which was visible across the valley. "He saw it in you too, Clarice. Took you longer to see it in yourself, but he knew you had it in you all along." The comment affected Clarice deeply. That evening, she shared the recording with me, tears in her eyes. "I spent so many years thinking he loved you more," she said. "But he wasn't playing favorites. He was just patient enough to let us each find our own way." It was true. Dad's apparent preference for me had never been about comparing his children's worth. It had been about recognizing that we would contribute to his legacy in different ways, and that my path would require earlier access to land ownership, while hers would unfold through different forms of leadership and service. The realization marked another turning point in our relationship. We began making formal plans to ensure the farm's long-term sustainability, establishing a board of directors that included David, Sarah, and several other alumni of our programs. We created an endowment fund to support ongoing operations and scholarship programs. Most importantly, we developed a succession plan that would allow the work to continue regardless of what happened to either of us. The legal structure we created was complex but necessary. The land itself would remain in a conservation trust that prevented development while allowing sustainable agriculture. The educational programs would be managed by a nonprofit organization with a board drawn from the community we had helped build. Financial support would come from a combination of sources: the endowment, ongoing fundraising, modest tuition fees, and revenue from the farm's agricultural operations. "We're creating something that's bigger than family," Clarice observed, as we reviewed the final documents with our lawyer. "Dad started with his children, but the real inheritance is the network of people who carry his values forward." The lawyer, a young woman who had grown up in the area before leaving for law school, nodded approvingly. This kind of community-owned development model is exactly what rural areas need, she said. You're creating economic opportunity while preserving agricultural heritage and environmental sustainability. It's a template that other communities could adapt. Indeed, we were already being contacted by groups from other states who wanted to learn from our experience. A delegation from a struggling farming community in Ohio spent a week with us, studying our educational programs and community development strategies. Rural organizers from Montana, Georgia, and New Mexico visited to explore how our model might work in different agricultural contexts. Each group of visitors brought their own perspectives and challenges, enriching our understanding of rural development issues. We learned about the unique difficulties facing ranch communities in the West, tobacco farmers in the Southeast, and dairy operations in the Midwest. These exchanges helped us refine our approaches and develop resources that could be adapted to different circumstances. One particularly impactful visit came from a group of Native American agricultural leaders who were working to revitalize traditional farming practices on reservation lands. They were interested in our youth education programs, but also challenged us to think more deeply about the historical and cultural dimensions of land stewardship. Land has memory, explained Robert Two Eagles, a Lakota farmer and educator from South Dakota. Your father understood that, but there are older memories here too, from the people who cared for this land before European settlement. Honoring all of those memories makes the teaching stronger. His words prompted us to research the indigenous history of our area more thoroughly. We learned that our property had been part of the traditional territory of the Potawatomi people, who had practiced sophisticated agricultural techniques for centuries before being forced to relocate in the 1830s. We reached out to contemporary Potawatomi communities and invited their elders to share traditional ecological knowledge with our students. The collaboration that developed was transformative for everyone involved. Potawatomi elders taught our young people about native plant species, traditional soil management practices, and the spiritual dimensions of agriculture that European American farming had largely forgotten. In return, our modern, sustainable techniques offered insights that contemporary Potawatomi farmers could apply on their own lands. Your father was trying to remember something his ancestors forgot, observed Maria Spotted Horse, a Potawatomi elder who became a regular visitor to our programs. The understanding that we are part of the land, not separate from it. That caring for the earth is caring for ourselves. These expanded cultural perspectives deepened the educational experience for everyone involved. Young people learned to see agriculture not just as a technical practice, but as a relationship between humans and the natural world that required respect, humility, and long-term thinking. They understood that the environmental crisis facing humanity was fundamentally a crisis of relationship, the result of forgetting our interdependence with other species and natural systems. The integration of indigenous perspectives also attracted new kinds of researchers and educators to our programs. Ethnobotanists came to study traditional plant uses. Environmental historians documented the ecological changes that had occurred since European settlement. Anthropologists explored how different cultures approach the relationship between humans and agriculture. This scholarly attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Academic conferences wanted to showcase our work. Publishers approached us about writing books describing our methods. Documentary filmmakers proposed projects that would share our story with national audiences. But we remained cautious about too much external attention, remembering Dad's preference for quiet, steady work over public recognition. We accepted some invitations and declined others, always asking whether a particular opportunity would genuinely advance our educational mission or simply feed our egos. The test came when a major television network proposed a reality show that would follow young people through our summer program. The exposure would be tremendous, potentially reaching millions of viewers and inspiring similar programs around the country. The financial benefits would be substantial, allowing us to expand our facilities and serve many more students. But the more we learned about how such shows were produced, the more uncomfortable we became. The network wanted to emphasize conflict and drama, to create narrative tension that would keep viewers engaged. They talked about casting decisions that would ensure a diverse and photogenic group of participants. They wanted to control the educational content to fit their storytelling needs. This isn't about education anymore, Clarice said after our final meeting with the producers. It's about entertainment that uses education as a backdrop. I agreed. The values that made our program effective, patience, community, deep listening, gradual growth, were exactly the opposite of what made compelling television. We declined the offer, knowing that we might never get another opportunity for such broad exposure. Instead, we focused on smaller-scale documentation projects that honored the authentic nature of our work. Sarah produced a series of short videos for online distribution that showed real students engaged in genuine learning experiences. David created a podcast that featured in-depth interviews with program alumni and their ongoing projects. Clarice developed a blog that shared practical information about sustainable agriculture while telling the human stories behind the technical details. These modest efforts reached smaller audiences, but created deeper connections. People who found our content were genuinely interested in the substance of what we were doing, not just entertained by the spectacle. They contacted us with thoughtful questions, shared their own experiences with similar projects, and often became long-term supporters of our work. One blog post that Clarice wrote about the lessons of composting, how decomposition and renewal are essential parts of healthy soil and healthy communities, was shared thousands of times and generated responses from readers around the world. A farmer in Kenya described how he was applying similar principles to rebuild soil damaged by industrial agriculture. A teacher in inner-city Detroit shared how she was using composting as a way to teach her students about cycles of growth and renewal. A retired engineer in Japan sent detailed plans for an improved composting system he had designed based on our descriptions. These connections reminded us that the work Dad had started on our small farm was part of a much larger movement of people trying to heal the relationship between humans and the natural world. We were not isolated pioneers, but part of a global community of farmers, educators, and activists who shared common values and faced similar challenges. This perspective was reinforced during a visit from Dr. Sarah Williams, a researcher from the University of Edinburgh who was studying community-based agricultural education programs around the world. She had spent time with similar projects in Scotland, New Zealand, Brazil, and India, and she was impressed by how our local work reflected universal principles. The specifics are different everywhere, she explained during a presentation to our board of directors. The crops, the climate, the cultural context, all of that varies, but the core insights are remarkably consistent. Young people learn best through direct engagement with meaningful work. Communities thrive when they control their own development processes. Environmental health and human well-being are inseparable. She encouraged us to document our methods more systematically and to participate in international networks of similar projects. This led to partnerships with agricultural education programs in Costa Rica, Ghana, and Vietnam, creating opportunities for cultural exchange that benefited students from all participating communities. The international connections brought new perspectives and energy to our work, but they also reinforced our commitment to staying rooted in our local community. We saw how programs that became too focused on external recognition sometimes lost touch with the needs of their immediate neighbors. We were determined not to make that mistake. This commitment was tested when our success began attracting a different kind of attention from within our own region. Some longtime residents worried that all the newcomers and visitors were changing the character of the area too rapidly. Property taxes were rising as land values increased. Traditional family farms were being pressured to sell to developers who catered to the growing population of educated professionals who wanted to live in a quaint rural setting. The tensions came to a head during a heated county commission meeting, where longtime farmers complained that their concerns were being overshadowed by the priorities of newcomers. One elderly farmer, whose family had worked the same land for 4 generations, stood up and pointed directly at me. "Your fancy programs are pricing us out of our own community," he said. "My grandson can't afford to buy farmland anymore because city folks with computer jobs are driving up prices. You're destroying the very thing you claim to be preserving." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Our success had contributed to increased interest in the area, which had indeed affected property values. The irony was painful. In trying to preserve agricultural community, we might be inadvertently contributing to its transformation into something else entirely. That criticism led to the most important community conversation we had ever facilitated. We organized a series of public meetings where longtime residents, recent arrivals, and young people from our programs could share their perspectives and concerns openly. The discussions were sometimes heated, but always respectful, guided by the communication skills we had developed through years of working with diverse groups of students. What emerged from those conversations was a deeper understanding of how community change could be managed more thoughtfully. Longtime residents had knowledge and connections that newcomers needed. Recent arrivals brought skills and energy that could benefit everyone. Young people offered fresh perspectives that could help bridge generational and cultural differences. Working together, we developed new initiatives that addressed the concerns that had been raised. We created a land trust program that helped established farming families retain ownership, while providing opportunities for young farmers to lease or gradually purchase property. We established a local food system that connected producers directly with consumers, ensuring that economic benefits stayed within the community. We developed workforce training programs that helped people of all ages acquire new skills without abandoning traditional knowledge. Most importantly, we recommitted to ensuring that our educational programs served local young people first and foremost. We reserved half of our summer program slots for students from our immediate area, with scholarships available for any local family that needed financial assistance. We created after-school and weekend programs specifically for area students, giving them ongoing access to agricultural education and career preparation. These efforts required constant balancing and frequent recalibration, but they reflected the core values Dad had modeled throughout his life, the understanding that real progress comes from patient collaboration, not dramatic gestures or imposed solutions. Change that lasts has to grow from within communities, guided by people who understand local conditions and respect established relationships. The approach was validated when the elderly farmer who had criticized us publicly approached me after a harvest festival we had organized. His grandson, it turned out, had been accepted into our young farmer training program and was excited about the possibility of eventually taking over the family operation using sustainable methods he was learning with us. "I was wrong to blame you for problems you didn't create," he said quietly. "You're doing good work here. My grandson is learning things I never knew about soil health and water management. Maybe old dogs can learn new tricks after all." That conversation reminded me of something Dad used to say about the difference between weathering storms and growing through them. Communities, like crops, could emerge stronger from difficult periods if they had deep roots and strong support systems. The challenges we had faced had forced us to examine our priorities and improve our practices, ultimately making our work more sustainable and our community more resilient. As autumn painted the hillsides in brilliant colors, I found myself reflecting on how much the landscape itself had been transformed during the years since Dad's death. The fields looked healthier, with richer soil and more diverse plantings. The forests were recovering from decades of poor management, with native species returning and wildlife populations growing. The waterways ran cleaner thanks to improved agricultural practices and reduced chemical runoff. But the most significant changes were less visible. The network of relationships that now connected hundreds of people across multiple generations and communities. Young farmers like David and Sarah were establishing their own operations and starting families, creating the next generation of agricultural leaders. Program alumni were scattered across the country and around the world, carrying the values they had learned into their various careers and communities. Clarice had documented many of these stories in her ongoing oral history project, creating a record of how individual lives had been shaped by their connection to the land and to the community we had built around it. Reading through her interviews, I was struck by how often people described their time at the farm as a turning point, the moment when they understood their own potential and began to see their place in something larger than themselves. "It wasn't just learning about farming," wrote Jennifer, a former student who was now teaching elementary school in Philadelphia, but spending her summers back at the farm with her own children. "It was learning about myself, about how to be patient, how to pay attention, how to work with other people to create something beautiful and useful." These reflections reminded me that Dad's legacy was not really about agriculture in any narrow sense. It was about education in its deepest meaning, the process of drawing out human potential and connecting individuals to community and purpose. The farm was simply the medium through which this transformation happened, the place where abstract values became concrete through daily practice and shared experience. This understanding was reinforced during our annual celebration of Dad's birthday, which had become a community-wide event that brought together current students, program alumni, supporting families, and community members. We would gather in the main field as the sun set, sharing food that had been grown on the farm and stories about how Dad's influence continued to shape our lives. The gathering was informal and unstructured, but certain traditions had emerged over the years. Someone would read excerpts from Dad's journals, which Clarice had discovered and preserved after his death. Young people would share updates on their projects and future plans. Community members would offer reflections on how the farm's work had affected the broader region. But the most meaningful part of each gathering was simply being together in the place Dad had loved, surrounded by the abundance his work had made possible. Children who had been born since his death played among the vegetable rows where their parents had learned to farm. Elderly community members sat in chairs arranged under the old oak tree, watching the next generation discover the same sense of wonder and connection that had drawn them to agriculture decades earlier. As darkness fell and fireflies began to dance among the crops, I would often think about the conversation Dad and I had shared that day when he was preparing the irrigation pipe. He had spoken about the land having stories, about the importance of roots, about wealth being what we give back to the earth rather than what we take from it. Now I understood that he had been preparing me not just for ownership, but for stewardship, not just for inheriting, but for transforming inheritance into something that could be shared. The deed that bore my name was just the beginning of a much larger process of creating lasting value through patient work and careful attention to what matters most. The land did indeed have stories, but they were not finished stories. Each season brought new chapters, new challenges, new opportunities to demonstrate the values Dad had embodied. Each young person who learned to read the signs of changing weather or to recognize the health of soil was adding their own story to the continuing narrative of this place. And in this ongoing process of growth and learning, of connection and community, Dad's presence remained strong, not as a memory frozen in the past, but as a living influence that continued to shape the future through the countless lives he had touched and the values he had planted in fertile ground. The inheritance he had left us was indeed far more valuable than money or property. It was the understanding that true wealth comes from what we nurture, that real security lies in what we build together, and that the most important gifts we can leave for future generations are not material possessions, but the wisdom and example that enable them to create meaningful lives of their own. This is the harvest that continues year after year, season after season, generation after generation, the endless abundance that flows from love properly tended, from community carefully cultivated, from the patient work of helping others discover their own connection to the land and to each other. It is Dad's gift to the world, and it will keep growing long after all of us who knew him personally have become part of the earth we served so faithfully during our brief time as its stewards.